Prof here. I was just getting ready to prepare for the release of documents related to UFOs because, the Friday announcement, the Strait was open and Iran had agreed to no nukes in perpetuity. We were close to a deal. And then, as President Trump posted on Truth Social, Iran decided to fire bullets yesterday in the Strait of Hormuz, a total violation of our ceasefire agreement. Many of them were aimed at a friendship and a freighter from the UK. That wasn't nice, was it? No, it wasn't. So he went on, my representatives are going to Islamabad. They will be there. They're en route. They're not there already. For negotiations. Iran, this was after Iran did a reversal. The strait is open. No, the strait is closed. Iran recently announced that they were closing the strait, which is strange because our blockade has already closed it. They're helping us without knowing, and they are the ones that lose with the closed passage, $500 million a day. We're offering a very fair and reasonable deal, and I hope they take it because if they don't, the United States is going to knock out every single power plant, every single bridge in Iran. No more Mr. Nice Guy. That was the president's response to the violation. For more on the topic and what may come out of this latest round of talks, however long it goes, shouldn't take 21 hours. Here's the deal. Take it or leave it. I'm sure with some, Easter eggs on the margins. More on this. Duncan Wood joins us, fellow at the Wilson Center, CEO of Hearst International Consulting as well. Duncan Wood, thanks for being with us. Appreciate it.
Great to be with you, Dan.
Nobody can be surprised who pays attention to this stuff by things not going as swimmingly as people had hoped on Fridays, starting with the markets, that there's going to be some push and pull, and this will be painstaking as long as you're dealing with the element in Iran that remains in power ostensibly. But something that Ambassador Walls said on This Week yesterday, Mike Walls, ambassador to the UN, said basically part of the U-turn by the Iranians is because there's chaos at the leadership level between the IRGC and, the gay Ayatollah or whoever, or Galibaf or whoever's in charge in terms of formally of the state, that it's a chaotic situation, which is why you're seeing a push and pull. He almost sort of left the impression that Iran is too busy negotiating with itself for us to intervene at this point.
It's interesting, Dan, because, of course, in international relations, we talk about something called interdomestic politics, which is, you have an international negotiation, but that has to be grounded in the domestic politics of each nation that's negotiating. And we certainly do see that, even with a seemingly monolithic system like the Iranian political system. Within there, you've got lots of vested interests that are, competing, collaborating, negotiating with each other, and, of course, with the leadership. But it's also true, of course, here in the United States. And, the dynamic of having the international negotiation, but the U.S. administration obviously concerned about midterm elections, the impact on the consumer, high gas prices, inflation, et cetera, all of that is coming to bear. And if we lay on top of that the fact that you've got a complete breakdown of trust both ways in this negotiation. I mean, the Iranians came out of the initial diplomatic talks sort of saying, we just don't believe that the United States is going to follow through. We have a lack of trust. And the U.S. saying very much the same thing about the Iranians. This makes it a very, very complex international negotiation. And so I think there's quite a long way to go yet in this conflict, just simply because we would need to build up some basic levels of trust. And both sides are betting that the other one is going to back down. You've got a Mexican standoff in that sense. And from the U.S. perspective, it's saying, well, the Iranians can't afford to keep the Strait of Hormuz closed. But the Iranians are saying exactly the same thing, because the longer the strait is closed, the longer that gasoline prices stay high here in the United States and everywhere else.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess my question is in part, okay, we can, the regime in Tehran is saying we can absorb whatever we need to absorb, and we're playing this long game in our minds. But Can they really? I mean, they're basically, it seems to me, they're sitting ducks both militarily and financially. Yes, they were able to engage in some acts of piracy over the weekend, but.
Yeah.
But I mean that they don't have any retaliatory capacity, and it doesn't seem like any of their allies of convenience, the Russians or the Chinese, are going to provide them any retaliatory capacity. So they're just a bobber in the water. So how long before that bobber sinks?
Yeah, it's a good point. And certainly militarily, the United States has shown overwhelming military power in this conflict and has been able to take out targets left, right, and center. But the Iranians are relying upon the fact that in this kind of unequal conflict, the mere ability to cause pain to the other side, in this case, the United States and the global economy, is enough to give them a certain amount of leverage and negotiating power. And so even though their Navy has been not wiped out, but severely handicapped by this conflict, they're still relying on essentially like very small boats packed with explosives, or of course the drones that we've heard so much about. And the kind of aerial drones that they've been using cost only $35,000, and they're very, very effective in causing a greater deal of anxiety in the Strait of Hormuz and of course in the broader region. And the naval drones that they have are also very, very cheap and can have a very big impact. So as long as you've got this kind of capacity on the side of the Iranians to strike back, this means it's going to be a very complex situation for the United States. And despite overwhelming military superiority, the United States still has, to consider the cost of all of this.
If my two concerns would be, if I'm looking at this from Trump's perspective, my two concerns would be one, if I start hitting all of these essentially infrastructure targets. One is, we significantly increase the number of civilian deaths, and that's going to be a bad look, and that can create sympathy. Do we create a refugee crisis if we turn the lights out, and that can create more sympathy and more human suffering we're trying to avoid? And then thirdly, if I wanted to just go after whatever's left of this regime, I could probably do it, even if I had to use special forces. But the problem, it seems to me, is with these guys, these mullahs, these Islamist terrorists, you just can't kill your way out of them. They just keep coming. They're just new ones right behind the old ones, as we sort of found out during our time in Iraq and Afghanistan. So to me, I'm thinking less about, and I would be thinking less about, Iran's wherewithal and more about how I could impose self-harm here by how I choose to prosecute this at this point.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Dan. And if we look at the recent history of U.S. activities in the Middle East, and let's just go back to the Iraq War. By taking out somebody who was undoubtedly evil, Saddam Hussein, what ended up happening was we created chaos in the Middle East, in Iraq in particular, which led to the spread of ISIS and other, really dangerous groups. And so that's the last thing that we want, is to turn Iran into a chaotic, anarchic situation where new threats will emerge both in the region and internationally. And that's why all these issues are so delicate. You can send a message, you can try to force the other side into a compromise, but ultimately you have to make the decision. Is causing more harm and really breaking down the structure of society going to be positive for the United States in the long term, or will it just result in chaos, which could, of course, impact the Strait of Hormuz specifically for a long, long time, other countries in the region very, very deeply, and ultimately have an impact on the global economy? So it's a balancing act that the United States has to play here. Obviously, they have their goals that they want to achieve, and the U.S. administration has been increasingly clear about what they're trying to get out of this conflict. But you don't want to tip it over into that kind of chaos and anarchy.
Yeah, and I don't. But in terms of the negotiating table, I don't know. We know what the demands are, and even if you agree to them, we know there would be. It's complicated to enforce after the fact, and that would be painstaking and go on sort of in an open-ended fashion. But what is it that we could even concede that would allow them to sign on the dotted line and save face, like they have, like we came to some sort of evenly distributed agreement about how the two countries will go forward in peace?
Well, I think that, what would be an acceptable outcome at this point in the conflict, not necessarily if we go back to the beginning of the conflict, but now knowing what, economic harm this conflict has caused. I would say that an acceptable outcome would be the Iranians agreeing to a complete suspension of their nuclear enrichment activities for a period of time. Now, what that period of time is, I don't know. The original U.S. proposal was 20 years. The Iranians rejected it, and President Trump himself says that wasn't good enough. But, if we did get 20 years, I would say that's a victory at this point. Even if we got 10 years, which I know a lot of folks on the side of the, within the administration would say, no, that's not good enough, because that was essentially what President Obama agreed to back in the, in the last decade. And we were unhappy with that. But at this point, if you've got a 10-year extension of the current of that deal, that wouldn't be a bad outcome. It just buys more breathing room and the opportunity to engage in a meaningful and constructive way with the administration in Iran. But nothing is guaranteed, and it's a very, very fragile situation which could be tipped over by any number of factors. So what I'm hoping for is that at least when the two sides get back to the negotiating table, they can establish a minimum level of trust between them and begin to talk in serious terms and hopefully make progress. And honestly, at this point in time, I think that's probably going to be something that we should celebrate if there is progress.
You wrote a piece about choke points, Strait of Hormuz being a choke point, and it's hardly the only one. A big one potentially is the South China Sea, which is why there's been so much focus on that with the rise of the Chinese Communist Party and the antagonism between the United States and China. So that sets up for Trump's meeting coming up with Xi. And I wonder how you think he comes to the table after not just the campaign in Iran, but the blockade of the Strait, and what he's willing to do to make sure that commerce flows freely around the globe, including the South China Sea. If that sort of reshapes Xi's understanding and the balance of power between those two representatives of the two major powers.
Yeah, I mean, obviously China has been extremely negatively impacted by the closure of the Strait of Hormuz because China gets so much of its energy from the Middle East. And so, on the specific issue of the Strait of Hormuz, President Xi is going to be, asking President Trump, to make every effort to make sure that is open again. I think President Trump will say, well, you know what? Why aren't the Chinese doing more to help out in this situation, either through, pressuring the Iranian regime, or by offering to maybe police the Strait of Hormuz. But that's a difficult thing to ask for. Do we really want the Chinese Navy operating in the Middle East?
No.
I mean, that's something that's very tricky, right?
No, but I would say maybe something that's leveraged, the Strait of Hormuz. Okay, well, South China Sea, don't mess around in the South China Sea and impede global trade. Because they've done it before, and they're trying to sort of establish where they would have the ability that the Iranians think they had with the Strait of Hormuz, and we don't want you to think you can do in the South China Sea what Iran had tried to do in the Strait of Hormuz. Yeah. That would be my message if I was Trump. Right?
I think that's a good point, Dan. The issue is that in recent years, the Chinese have become increasingly sophisticated in their use of choke points, and rather than focusing on geographic choke points like the South China Sea or the Strait of Malacca, is what they've been doing in terms of the critical inputs into the global economy, critical minerals, rare earth elements, etc., and saying, if we just cut off the supply of these basic raw materials, which, becomes essentially a supply chain choke point, if we do that, we can essentially cripple Western industry. And they've been using that to great effect. And so the Chinese, I think, have got themselves into a situation right now where they actually have serious leverage both with the United States and with the Europeans and other countries in the world, because they have managed to concentrate so much of the world's supply of these critical inputs within their own economy. And that's what they turn to increasingly. They've done it to great effect with the Japanese, with the Europeans, with the United States in recent years. And that's, I think, where the negotiations probably have to be.
Duncan Wood is a fellow at the Wilson Center. He's also CEO of Hearst International Consulting. Duncan Wood, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. Great pleasure.
And he joined us on the alphawealthgroup.com answer line.
This is the morning show more Chicago radio listeners are choosing. This is Chicago's Morning Answer on AM 560. The Answer.
Signature Bank is Chicago's fastest growing independently owned business bank, a bank where relationships still matter. Signature Bank knows your name and your story. I'm Dan Proft, and I know